So I am very excited to chat with Dr. Erin Kinney, and we're going to be talking about adrenal health. So I think everyone is going to find this to be extremely valuable. So let me quickly dive into Dr. Erin's bio, as she is a naturopathic doctor, speaker, author, and podcast host who helps stressed out patients improve their mood, balance their hormones, and increase their energy. She is incredibly passionate about teaching her patients to understand why stress causes so many problems in the body and how they can change their response to stress so that they can take control in both their bodies and their lives. And thanks for joining us, Dr. Erin.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. I mean, adrenals is just something that really applies to everybody, even though some people like myself are in denial. Like when I dealt with Graves years ago, and I was like, oh, stress. I knew stress was a factor, but I just didn't think my adrenals. I thought I was good at handling the stress, and then when I did some adrenal testing, I realized that wasn't the case. And yeah, so definitely something that even if someone feels like they're doing a good job of managing the stress, just that might not be the case. And so, yeah, if we could talk about briefly your background, get a little bit more into why you are doing what you do now, how you started the podcast, why are you helping so many people
Sure.
restore the health of their adrenals?
Yeah. Well, I think like many of us in this field, it started for me with a personal health journey. When I was in my early 20s, I went from being a marathon runner, like this happy, you know, high achieving college student to within a year's time, I couldn't get out of bed. My joints hurt. I'd gained 30 pounds and I was crying all the time. And after maybe 6 months of living this way, when you're depressed, it's kind of hard to admit that you're depressed. Finally, my parents were like, you need to go see a doctor. So I go to my primary care. And before I could even finish kind of telling him all the symptoms I was experiencing, because I had a lot more than I just mentioned, he was like, oh, you're depressed. Here's some Wellbutrin. And kind of sent me on my way. And I left his office feeling kind of defeated. I was like, well, this is your answer? Like, I had all these questions. I was like, well, I'd become a vegan and I thought I was eating this really healthy diet, but I was like, maybe I'm not doing the right thing with my diet, or maybe there's something emotional going on. And, he didn't address any of that. So I was in therapy at the time, and my therapist was kind of listening to me talk after this experience with the primary care provider. And she was like, I think you need to go see this some sort of holistic natural doctor. I just had lunch with him. I don't really know what he does, but I think you should go see him. So he was a naturopathic doctor, and I went and saw him. He spent about 2 hours with me on the first visit, kind of got a lot of details, really understood my symptoms, really listened to me, which felt amazing, right? It's really nice to feel listened to when you don't feel well. And he ran a bunch of tests. And when all the testing came back, my adrenals were really, really underfunctioning. My B12 was low. All my nutrient levels were low. My hormones were kind of out of whack. And he put me on a treatment protocol, and about 8 weeks later, I felt almost 75-80% better. I'd lost some weight. My energy was back. I'd stopped crying. I could actually enjoy life again. And I was like, wow, this was really cool. And at the time I was working for my family business, which was industrial manufacturing. It wasn't really the best thing to be doing at age 23. I was living in the middle of nowhere in Delaware. And so he kind of helped me mix them. He's like, maybe you're not happy in your career. So I ended up getting a job in recruiting. So this is kind of a long-winded story, but I got a job in recruiting, and I was doing temporary recruiting. So I interviewed about 80 to 100 people a day. And I love talking to people. Love it. My boss, about 6 months in, sat me down and she goes, I don't think this is the right career for you. And I was like, what do you mean? She's like, well, you keep bringing me all these resumes and you're like, oh, listen to this woman. She had lupus and she had to have all these symptoms, and here's what happened. And this is why she left her job. And my boss was like, I don't really care that she had lupus. I want to know, can she do this job or not? And she's like, but you really care. She's like, you keep coming and bringing me these resumes, and all you're talking about is their health. She's like, I think you might want to go into something in the health field. And I kind of sat with that for a minute. And I was like, wow, you know what? I think she's right. I really like health. So I went back and had lunch with the naturopathic doctor that treated me and was like, I want to do what you do. How do you do this? He actually told me not to do it, which is kind of amusing. He's like, it's a really tough career. You'll have to run your own business. It's going to be an uphill battle. And I was like, that sounds like fun. Exactly what I want to do. So anyways, I quit my job. I went back to naturopathic school, and I really wanted to help people that were struggling just like I was, that they had a bunch of random symptoms that seemed kind of unrelated, and then been to see their doctor, and their doctor was just like, oh, you're depressed. Or if they were female, oh, you just need the birth control pill, and kind of written off. And, I felt very dismissed, and that didn't feel good. So I now specialize in treating men and women that kind of come into my office feeling similar to the way that I did. They're like, hey, I'm really tired, I've gained weight, my joints hurt, and they maybe have all these random symptoms, which we'll talk about why that happens. At the end of the day, for most of them, chronic stress has had a major impact on their body and has affected their adrenals. And when we affect the adrenals, and again, I'll talk about the physiology of this as we kind of dive into this more, you will start to have an impact on every other system in the body. So we can start to see these kind of seemingly unrelated symptoms in different systems of the body act up. And so some people are like, wow, I don't know what's wrong. Should I go see this specialist or this specialist or this specialist? And they go see all the specialists, and the specialists are like, yeah, there's something wrong with you. Your labs are normal. Everything checks out normal, but they still don't feel well. And so I get these people that land in my office and they're like, I don't know what to do. I've been to see 5 different specialists. I've been to see primary cares. I've been to see so-and-so, and they all tell me I'm normal, but I feel like shit. Excuse my French. I don't know if we can curse, but they don't feel well. Right. So anyway, so that's kind of how I got into this. I'm really passionate about it because it's the medicine that really helped me.
All right. No, thanks for sharing that story. And yeah, as far as the physiology, if we could go just even more basic, like what are the
Yep.
adrenals? Why are they so important? And then, yeah, if you want to talk a little
Sure.
bit about the physiology.
So the adrenal glands are the little glands that sit on top of your kidneys, and they are responsible for producing cortisol, epinephrine, and what we think of as your stress hormones. So we call them the catecholamines, which are, again, like adrenaline type things. So, and what happens in the body is, let's say, I'm going to describe what happens if we're under acute stress. So let's say I'm sitting in this room and a lion jumps here, which would never happen, but we're going to pretend this. A lion jumps in here, my body's going to go, oh my gosh, I need to either run or fight. Hopefully I choose to run. And so what happens is this part of my brain called the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that kind of senses whether something is a stressor or not. It's a very black or white, it's a very old part of our brain. There's no higher reasoning. It will be like, this is a stress or this isn't. If it decides it's a stress, it will send a signal to another part of my brain called the hypothalamus. And that part of the brain will then send another signal called a hormone called cortico-releasing hormone to your adrenal glands. There's actually a couple more steps, but I'm going to simplify it here. So your adrenal glands receive this signal and they're like, oh, stress, we better pump out some cortisol and some adrenaline. So those two hormones flood the system. And what happens when those hormones flood our system is all the blood flow goes in our arms and our legs because we want to be ready to run or to fight. So meaning the blood flow leaves the abdominal organs, it leaves the testes, ovaries, it leaves kind of the other, the organs that thrive when we're in that rest and digest state. Our heart rate goes up, our blood sugar goes up, our blood pressure goes up. So we get into this state where the body's ready to run or fight, right? Now, what's supposed to happen is once I get safe from said lion or whatever the, acute stressor is, and the body's like, whew, all right, I'm safe. That same cortisol molecule, and I'm going to touch a little bit more on cortisol in a minute, but that same cortisol molecule will go back to that hypothalamus part in the brain, and it will bind to what I like to call an off button. It binds to a receptor in the hypothalamus that then turns off further production of that cortico-releasing hormone. So essentially turns off further production of cortisol. And so then the body will go back into that rest and digest state, or it's supposed to. And what happens is all the blood flow will come back to the abdominal organs, heart rate goes down, blood pressure goes down, blood sugar goes down. The system then relaxes. And so we were designed to be able to go into this acute stress state when needed, but then we were also designed to be able to very quickly come out of that state. And here's what happens is in today's world, most of us end up getting into that acute stress state, and then we don't come out of it. We stay stuck there. And the reason we stay stuck there is what happens is, I love to use March of 2020 as an example. Everyone remembers that really fun month where we had no idea what was happening. And it was like every 5 minutes, new information was coming out and our bodies were like, oh my God, more stress, more stress. And so that hypothalamus part of our brain where, it should be receiving that cortisol to, again, turn off, right? For that off button, the body's like, you know what? I'm pretty sure that my stress response is just going to keep getting triggered over and over again. So it actually stops making that receptor. It downregulates the production of that off button. It's also known as a glucocorticoid receptor, which accepts, anyways. So we stop making that receptor. And now literally your body, even if the cortisol goes back there, it can't turn off. So we get kind of stuck in this fight flight mode. And this is where problems start to arise because again, we're only designed to spend a short amount of time. About 10 to 15% of our lives, we're supposed to be in that acute stress phase. Most of us in today's world spend about 80 to 90% in that, in that fight flight state. So, and we in the fight flight stage for some period of time. But what happens is, again, if you're in that fight flight stage, your adrenals are pumping out, those, that adrenaline, that cortisol over and over and over constantly. And typically when we're pumping those out, we don't sleep, we don't rest very well when we're in that stage. And the body needs rest in order to continually produce cortisol. Cortisol is what I like to call a very metabolically expensive hormone. It takes a lot of cofactors. It's a big steroidal type molecule. And so if you stay in that chronic stress state, you will eventually run out of the building blocks to build more cortisol. And so what we start to see is a decline in cortisol the longer that you stay in this chronic stress state. And here's the thing about cortisol. Most of us think of it as the stress hormone. It is, but it's really the hormone your body makes in order to give you energy to deal with stress. So it's a very different, that's like kind of a slight distinction, but it's very different. So everyone always is like, oh, when I teach workshops, I'll be like, hey, what do you think about cortisol? I'm like, oh, it's bad. It makes you fat. It makes you this. And I'm like, well, actually, like too much cortisol, yes, is a problem. Too little cortisol is also a problem. It's very similar to blood sugar in all reality. Like we don't want cortisol to be too high, just like we don't want blood sugar to be too high. And we also don't want it to be too low. We want it to be right in the middle. And like I said, cortisol is the thing that gives you energy to deal with stress. It's also the thing that gives you energy just in your everyday life. It's what wakes you up in the morning. It's what governs your circadian rhythm. So we have this natural rhythm of what cortisol is supposed to look like throughout the day. But a third really important function of cortisol is it's actually one of your body's major anti-inflammatory molecules. So most of you listening may have heard of prednisone, or maybe you've taken prednisone or a steroid at some point in your life. Cortisol is the body's natural form of a steroid. So essentially prednisone is synthetic cortisol. So when we have been stressed for a prolonged period of time and we start to run out of the building blocks of cortisol and we start to see a decline in the levels of cortisol, we can start to get unchecked inflammation in the system, which could look like joint pain, could look like depression if we have inflammation in the brain, could look like digestive disturbances, could look like acne, could look like skin flares. So if you're kind of like, wow, I've had a lot of these random symptoms and I can't quite figure out what they are, it's really important to get your cortisol levels checked, because in most of the cases that I see, most of the patients that come in, they're like, yeah, I've been super stressed. Again, because most people know they've been stressed, right? And they'll come in and they're like, I'm pretty sure my cortisol is going to be high. And I'm like, probably it's going to be low. It's very rare that I see a case of super high cortisol these days. Mostly people come in and their cortisol levels are low. And people are like, wait, what? I don't understand that. I thought cortisol was bad. Why do you want to raise it? I'm like, no, because you need that cortisol to give you energy. You need it to kind of, I call it the fix it hormone. It's the hormone that fixes things in the system. So if you don't have enough of it, we're going to start to see things go wrong. So that's my basic physiology explanation. I could talk a little bit more, but I think that gives you the basic gist of things. And
Yeah,
when cortisol levels are low, we call this adrenal fatigue. It's kind of what the functional medicine space has termed this, this state of the body.
Yeah, that described me as far as having low cortisol levels when I again dealt with Graves' disease years ago, and I wouldn't have guessed that my cortisol would be low. And as you mentioned, some people would suspect their cortisol high, and then they look at whether it's a saliva test or dried urine test, and we'll talk about some of the testing that you prefer. But when someone sees a high cortisol pattern, what does that mean? Does that mean that their body's still adapting to the stress, whereas like if it's low, their body kind of has lost the ability to adapt to the chronic stress?
Here's the thing. So in your case, let's use you as an example. Like your cortisol probably was very high for a period of time. Probably while this is, I mean, I don't know all the details about your case, but most people aren't coming to the doctor. Most people aren't coming to the doctor when they're in that, let's say that you go through a divorce, and your stress levels are really high for a couple of years. Typically, when you're making excess cortisol to kind of keep you going, you're functioning okay, right? Your body, because again, that cortisol is giving you energy, and you might be running on, might be not operating on a lot of sleep, but you're kind of getting through it. But then over time, as the cortisol levels start to decline, this is when people start to feel bad, and that's when they end up going to the doctor. So for most people that have low cortisol, there was probably a point in time when their cortisol was high. It probably just wasn't when they're getting it checked. Now, you ask, if people are seeing high cortisol, what does that mean? That usually just means they're still in the acute, the initial phases of that fight flight stage. And I will tell you that the cases that I see currently where people have elevated cortisol and they feel like crap, those are usually the cases where people have chronic Lyme, mold exposure, or really bad EBV. And I know we were going to talk about this and we can get into it, but those things are all what I like to call internal stressors. They're things that are causing the stress response to go off on the inside of the inside of the body is triggering that stress response versus an external stressor, which might be work or pandemic or the lion that I mentioned, something outside of your body. And again, in those cases, they will eventually have low cortisol, but some of them are actually coming in because they really don't feel good because of the other things that are going on, if that makes sense.
Could that be a reason also why a lot of times you see with these stealth infections, people have problems sleeping just because
Yes.
they keep on pumping
Their
out cortisol?
cortisol. Yes, and one of the reasons why the body does that is one of cortisol's functions, what I didn't mention, is when cortisol is high, it will activate the immune system. It turns the immune system on. And it's like immune system, you need to, so the whole fight flight thing, we think of it being like fighting something external, but usually that fighting is we're fighting something internal. Like if you get COVID and you have a really high fever, your cortisol level is going to go up because that's what's going to turn on the immune system. And if we're talking about autoimmune conditions, chronic levels of high cortisol can trigger the immune system to start attacking itself. And then eventually, kind of once that if that autoimmune thing has turned into a disease state, we will see low cortisol kind of on the other side. But typically, in most cases, developing an autoimmune thing, I mean, there's a lot of other factors, but the high levels of cortisol can play a role in that.
And do you also see when someone typically has low cortisol levels that their DHEA will be low? Because that definitely was the case with myself, and I see that a lot with my patients.
Yeah, so DHEA is a precursor molecule to both cortisol and testosterone. So it's something the body kind of uses as a reserve that it can convert into cortisol. And yes, in most cases, once the adrenals have kind of fully bottomed out, you will see low DHEA. Sometimes it depends on where you catch it, right? So and it also depends on where the body's prioritizing things. And this, with women and their sex hormones, progesterone and estrogen, and sometimes testosterone, if the body's prioritizing the sex hormones, we can see a lower level of cortisol. Versus I have some cases where all the hormones are bottomed out, but the cortisol looks okay. That could still be an adrenal fatigue type state. And that's where the body is actually stealing from those other hormones to shunt them over to cortisol to keep up dealing with whatever stress is going on in their system. But to answer the question about low DHEA, yes, it's really common to see that. However, I will sometimes see DHEA being normal, or in some cases, DHEA will be really high and the cortisol is really low. And that there can be conversion issues there, which is a separate issue. But you can see DHEA being kind of all over the map.
So let's talk about the testing. What testing do you recommend when it comes to evaluating the adrenals?
So in my practice, I typically start out with just general blood work, and I test a fasting DHEA, a fasting cortisol, and a fasting testosterone, because testosterone can also give me some insight. If it's too low as well, it can tell me like, oh, the adrenals might be stealing. And women, I will be also testing their other sex hormones. That's usually where I start. Now, that's just giving us a quick snapshot. If the cortisol is super, super low, I'm obviously be like, hey, your adrenals are low. Or if the cortisol is super, super high, we're going to do something different. If it's kind of middle of the range and their symptoms are all screaming adrenal fatigue, that's when I might suggest further adrenal testing. And further adrenal testing can look like there's a test called the Dutch test, which I really like, which is urine. And it looks at cortisol, it looks at cortisone, and it looks at like the cortisol metabolites. It looks at all of the other sex hormones. There's different options, but I like the Dutch test complete because it gives you a very complete picture of what's going on. So that can be really great. Or you can do what we call a 4-point cortisol, the salivary cortisol. And that's when you'll kind of collect saliva at 4 points throughout the day. And then you can actually see the cortisol graph. So you can see, hey, maybe it's low in the morning and it's high at night, or maybe we start out good and then we crash midday. And that can be a helpful test. But what I will tell you, and I will tell your listeners, is 90% of the time, you can probably guess what your cortisol is doing based off of your energy levels without caffeine or stimulants. So if you wake up and you don't drink coffee and your level is great, your energy level is great, and you wake up and you're like, oh, I'm like an 8 out of 10. And then slowly your energy dwindles throughout the day. That's a really normal, healthy. That tells me that your cortisol levels are pretty normal and healthy. If you wake up and you like cannot get out of bed and you're super exhausted, but then maybe by like noon, you're like, okay, my energy picks up. And then by like 4 p.m., you're like flying. That will typically indicate that your cortisol is low in the morning and is high at night. So for the majority of the cases when I'm working with patients, again, I get that fasting cortisol, morning cortisol to kind of see where things are. And then I take a really good history. And in some cases, if people are drinking a ton of caffeine, I'm like, hey, you gotta go off caffeine for a couple of days and let me know what your energy's like off of that. Because caffeine will mask your energy levels and kind of what you're truly doing. But you can usually get a sense for what your adrenals or how they're functioning just by your energy levels throughout the day.
Okay, so it sounds like pretty much across the board, morning cortisol, DHEA, testosterone. So again, all this is fasting, and then it depends on the person. So not everybody will get a Dutch test. Not everybody will get like a saliva test.
Yeah, I don't I honestly actually don't run them as often as you would think, given this is but it's usually because I pretty much know what they're gonna say. And every now and some patients will come in, they're like, "I'd like to run this," and I have no problem running the test, but they're expensive, and some people don't. I'd rather my patients spend their money on, the treatment protocol to get them better than, and again, unless it's a case where I'm like, "Oh, this is interesting, you're not responding to the treatment, and it's a little bit weird," then I would say, "Hey, I would like to order this." But the majority of the time, I'm just doing that, the general blood work and going off of clinical symptoms.
And can you explain, do you see a relationship between adrenal problems and thyroid problems in your practice?
Yes, 100%. I actually I treat a lot of thyroid patients, but almost all of them there's an interplay with the and here's I like to explain when I'm looking at all of the endocrine system. I don't know if this is video, but if you're not watching and you're listening, if you think about a triangle, there's four major players in the endocrine system. We have the thyroid hormones, we have the adrenal hormones, and we have the sex hormones, and we have the blood sugar metabolism. And so if you think about a triangle, the top three, the thyroid, the adrenals, and the sex hormones are in this very delicate triangular balance. If one goes up or one goes down, it's going to affect the other two. We can't move one without moving the other two. If you put your hands in a little, like make a triangle with your fingers and play around with moving one up and down, you'll notice that if one moves, the other are going to move. So typically, if we see adrenal function go up, we're going to see a dip in thyroid function. If we see sex hormones go down, we're going to see a shift in, adrenal hormones and the thyroid hormones. So they're always connected. And this is where, I get a lot of patients with thyroid and they're like, "Hey, I went to my endocrinologist and they told me that my TSH is fine and this is fine." But, they're exhibiting all these symptoms of maybe hypothyroidism, but also maybe adrenal stuff. And, sometimes they do have an actual thyroid issue, but sometimes they have slightly underfunctioning thyroid, and because of what's going on with their adrenals or because of what's going on with their sex hormones. And then the last piece there is your blood sugar. And, if you go back to making that triangle with your hands, the blood sugar, I like to say that's the thing that keeps the triangle. It's like what's holding the triangle up. So it's what's keeping all of these things steady. So this is why diet and, keeping a healthy diet is so important for all of your hormones, because if your blood sugar is doing this and it's going all, it's very hard. So if you've got a triangle sitting on top of something that's wobbling, it's very hard to keep those other hormones regulated if we don't have steady blood sugar. So that was a long-winded answer to your question. Yes, I do see patients with thyroid issues have adrenal problems.
Let's talk more about blood sugar and diet. What do you consider to be a healthy diet?
So that's going to vary per person, but kind of if we're looking at in this hormone realm, the diet that keeps your blood sugar the most balanced is going to be a healthy diet for you. And for some people, that may be eating, animal protein several times a day with veggies and low carbs. Other people that might just be eating a really balanced meal 3 times a day. It's gonna depend on a lot of other factors. If you've got someone with severe food allergies and gut stuff going on, they might need a very different diet. Someone who's got a healthy, a digestive tract. So I'm big when I talk about all this stuff on my show, the diet piece. It's really helpful to get support for this, like work with a practitioner who kind of knows what they're doing and can help you figure out what the right diet lifestyle program is for you at this given point. Because especially for men too, but mostly for women, women's hormones change quite frequently throughout our lives. And at each hormonal stage, you may have a different nutritional need. You may have a different diet that's going to keep your blood sugar more stable, or a different diet that's going to, and um, so to answer your question, there's not really one diet protocol that I subscribe to. It's really going to be individualized.
Yeah, good response. I agree with
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
There's
And
obviously
I'm
varies person to
I'm
person.
currently a really big fan of CGMs, of using a continuous glucose monitor to kind of figure out what kind of eating protocol is going to keep your blood sugar balanced. And the main way that blood sugar has an impact on the hormone is what it does to the adrenal system. So if your blood sugar dips, that's going to send a signal to the hypothalamus that there's a stress. It's like, "Oh my gosh, we don't have blood sugar." It's going to actually activate your fight flight response. And so what will happen is we get the cortisol flood, because another one of cortisol's jobs, and I mentioned this earlier, is when we're in fight flight, our blood sugar goes up, whether you've eaten or not. And so typically what we'll see is if you skip a meal and your blood sugar dips down, you will then get a blood sugar rise. And again, whether you've eaten or not. And sometimes if you haven't eaten, you'll get more of a spike. And this is because cortisol will go tell your liver to break down stored glucose in a form of glycogen, and that will, again, cause the blood sugar to go up. It's really interesting. I have several patients right now that are pilots, and they fly, all over the world, and their stress level is super high. They eat no sugar. Their A1Cs are like 7.8. So for those of you who don't know what A1C is, a 3-month average of your blood sugar. Normal is between 5 and 5.5. So 7.8 is very high, which tells us that their blood sugar on average is too high. But these guys don't eat any sugar. And the reason their blood sugar is high is because their stress levels are so high. So again, this is where, using a CGM to kind of figure out like what the best diet for you to keep your blood sugar balanced can be a really helpful tool.
And for those listening who don't know what CGM is, it's a continuous glucose monitor. And do you have people on these like for many months or just for a few weeks?
I honestly will recommend, I mean, if we're dealing with a blood sugar situation, maybe we'll have them on it for a few months, but a 2 to 4 week period where you kind of just try out certain things. You'll be like, hey, let me see what intermittent fasting does to my blood sugar. Let me see what eating protein 3 times a day does to my, let me see what my exercise protocol or routine is doing to my blood sugar. Let me see what watching scary TV, because food is one input, but we have all these other inputs that can impact our blood sugar. So so a couple of weeks can be really, really helpful to kind of learn what works and what doesn't work for your body. And it's so cool that we have this. I mean, you can get one of the old finger prick things, but that's super annoying. And the CGMs have been really helpful for some of my patients where we really struggle to figure out what's going on with their insomnia, where they wake up frequently. And a lot of patients were finding out that they're getting blood sugar dips, when they're waking up. And that's actually what's waking them up. The blood sugar dips, puts the body into fight flight, and then the blood sugar spikes. So we've, kind of worked with like adding in some protein before bed and doing some other things to balance the blood sugar during the day. And then their sleep improves, which is cool.
So you spoke about you spoke about diet. I want to definitely talk about supplements. But before we do that, stress management. So what do you recommend from a stress management
So
perspective?
I don't really love the term stress management. I mean, it's a term we use, and I use it sometimes as well. But most of the external stress in our life, you're not going to be able to change that. I mean, maybe you can. Maybe you could leave your job. But most people, if your job's really stressful, leaving your job might be more stress, right? Or if you're in a relationship where there's stress, leaving that situation, like getting away from it's not always the answer. What I typically recommend is essentially what we need to do if your body is kind of stuck in that fight flight state is you need to remind the body that it's okay to chill out. So typically my protocols are having the patient build in micro moments of relaxation throughout their day. So usually I have patients start with, I want you to find 5 to 10 minutes where you're going to lay flat and listen to music or meditate or just lay flat and chill out for 10 minutes. And I like when you lay flat because it allows the blood pressure to go down. It allows the heart rate to go down. Essentially, it's telling the body it's okay to come out of fight flight. And the more we do this, the more the body will be like, oh, yeah, it's okay. Let me go make some more of those glucocorticoid receptor off buttons. So then it will allow the body to turn off even more. And this is actually why meditation and a lot of the supplements that we'll talk about when we kind of look at why they're helpful for, helping the nervous system is the action is that they increase the production of the glucocorticoid receptor in the hypothalamus. So like one of my favorite herbs is rhodiola, which is a fantastic herb for kind of regulating the nervous system. It will, if cortisol is too high, it will bring it down. If cortisol is too low, it will bring it up. But one of its other actions is it increases the production of those off buttons. So it essentially gives the body more resiliency. It allows the body to be able to come out of fight flight after it's been stressed. And so that's kind of and I kind of rewire people's thought process. They're like, oh, I need to manage my stress. I'm like, really, no, we just need to build in more relaxation periods because again, and I work with a lot of really high functioning individuals. I get like CEOs and women that run their own business and, and a household and, they do a lot of things. And I'm not going to tell them, hey, you need to shut down your business or you need to have less children or, you can't change a lot of the things that are going on in your life. But what I can say is, hey, I need you to sit down with your schedule. I need you to build in 10 minutes in the morning, 10 minutes in the afternoon. We need to have some downtime structured into your weekends. So it's really about making some lifestyle changes. We do supplementation as well and work on the diet, but kind of building in those relaxation practices are the number one thing that will get you better. And I find my patients that add those things in, they fare really well. And what's interesting is when I was first kind of doing this, I recommended meditation to everyone. And meditation is fantastic. It's probably the best thing you can do for your health. But if you're kind of stuck in this fight flight stage, meditating is really hard. Like you're like, I can't get my thoughts to calm down. And patients would do it maybe for a week and then they'd stop. But so then I started kind of tweaking things, be like, okay, let's just build on these little micro practices that are much easier for someone to digest. And it's it's kind of meeting the patient where they are in terms of where their nervous system is. And mostly what I find is that when my patients will start to incorporate these little moments, is if they do that for a couple of months, they'll come back to me, they're like, hey, I finally downloaded that meditation app and I've actually been meditating for 20 minutes a day. Like I lengthened the amount of time that I lay horizontal and I built in a meditation, which is, I'm like, that's fantastic. That's exactly where I wanted you to be. But if I told them to do that initially, it wouldn't have worked. So that's been kind of the evolution of my working with my patients on that piece.
So if someone's working a 8 to 5, 9 to 5 job, and what would you say, like during the lunch break, just to
Mhm.
take 10
Yep.
minutes and maybe
Take
just
10
go
minutes.
at their desk or in their car just to
Yep. Yeah, and if you
have some.
can't, if your workplace is busy and you can't do it in the office, like go outside. I have some patients that will go outside and they will lay on the ground, that's like extra credit because if you get the earth, you're gonna get the good grounding energy. And occasionally I'll have someone that's like they try the lying down thing and they're like, it feels too foreign. I feel like I can't relax. I'll have them go take a walk, like a mindful walk. I'll go take a 10-minute walk, be outside, try to do it quiet with no music and just enjoy, the nature. And there's so much research on even just looking at a picture of a plant will help increase the production of those off buttons in the brain. So, nature is really, really beneficial for helping to calm our nervous system down. So, if you're someone who's like, oh, I don't know that I could do the laying down thing, that's not going to work with my 9 to 5 job, go take a walk outside. That can be really helpful as well.
So supplements, you mentioned rhodiola as one of them. What are some of the other favorite supplements to support adrenals?
Well, so when patients' adrenals are pretty bottomed out, so if they come in their cortisol, so typical morning cortisol range is between 6 and 20. I like to see morning cortisol around 15. So if they're anything under 15, especially if they're under 10, I use a lot of adrenal glandulars. So I'm giving them a little bit of adrenal tissue that they take in the morning to kind of bump that adrenal production up in the morning. And then, we kind of let the natural progression happen throughout the rest of the day. So I use a little bit of that. I like magnesium, B5, and B6 because those are the major cofactors that the body needs in order to build cortisol. So those are my three favorites. And they're also really calming to the nervous system. So those could be fantastic. And herb-wise, rhodiola, as I mentioned, and I really like ashwagandha. Those are probably the two primary herbs that I use. There's tons of other, what we call adaptogens, but those are the two that I use the most. If there's also some immune issues, I really like mushrooms, like a mushroom blend. I'll put people on like a mushroom blend because that helps stimulate the immune system and they also act as a really nice adaptogen.
What are your thoughts of licorice root?
Licorice root is okay. It tends to spike blood pressure a little bit. So if someone has really low blood pressure, that can be fantastic. The glycerinic acid in it, is usually a no-no for people that have high blood pressure. Most people with low adrenals tend to have low blood pressure, but I just like to be careful with that one. It's pretty stimulating. So if someone is having trouble sleeping, that's not my favorite go-to. But if someone's sleeping fine and their energy is still pretty low, that can be a nice herb to use.
Okay, so it sounds like rhodiola maybe is your number one go-to.
That's
Ashwagandha
the number
also
one
you like a
go-to.
lot.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Those are my
yeah.
favorites.
And then B5, B6, magnesium.
Yep. So B5 in the pantothenic acid form and B6 in the um, uh, P5P, which is no, excuse me, it's the pyridoxal is the B6. So you want to make sure you get the right forms of those guys.
And do you have them take it separately typically, or do you have them take it as part of a B complex?
No, I typically have them take that separate. You can take a B complex, but I have some formulas in my office where it's the adrenal cortex with the magnesium, the B5, the B6, and the rhodiola. That's kind of like a blend that I really like to use a lot. But when I'm recommending things at workshops, I'll say because in certain cases, if there's any sort of methylation issue going on, which like if someone has an MTHFR mutation, which I see a lot in people with adrenal fatigue, um, the B complex can kind of set them off a little bit, particularly if their system's been super stressed. So I tend to stay away from too much folate or B12. So unless their B12 and folate levels are super, super low, which is a different case. But I really like the B5 and B6 because they don't they don't cause the body to overmethylate. They kind of help stabilize the methylation process as well.
So getting back to Epstein-Barr, mold, Lyme, which you mentioned earlier, how
Mhm.
common do you see these stealth infections in your practice?
Well, let's talk about EBV first. Epstein-Barr virus, probably 90% of the human population gets exposed to that virus at some point in their life. So 90% of people usually test positive for either an old infection of EBV, and a lot of my patients, I'll see they have a reactivated case of EBV. And as I mentioned, these stealth infections are major internal stressors. So sometimes I'll get patients that come in and I'll ask about their stress levels, and they're like, yeah, I'm not that stressed. Like everything else in their external world is pretty good. And they're like, I don't really feel stressed mentally, but my body feels stressed. And those are the people that I'm definitely going to, go and look for they usually have stealth infections going on. So again, EBV is really common. It's not always reactivated in people, but most people have had it. So I screen everyone for EBV, for mold markers, and for Lyme, just because I want to make sure that that's not something that we're dealing with. Lyme, unfortunately, is becoming a lot more common. And I wish that wasn't the case, because it's complicated and difficult to treat. And there's a lot of nuances even in the testing and the diagnosing of it. But again, it can be a major internal stressor that causes a lot of problems and can put someone in adrenal fatigue.
Yeah, and it's a little bit of a catch-22, because a lot of times the emotional stressors could drag down the immune system, making someone more susceptible to Lyme, Bartonella, EBV,
Yep.
other
Yeah.
viruses as well.
Yeah.
And you mentioned
Well,
mold markers.
yeah,
Sorry,
go
what were
ahead.
you going to say?
No, I can circle back. What about the mold markers?
I was going to ask, do you recommend mold markers in the blood or urinary mycotoxin testing?
So that'll depend on my clinical history. If someone is like, yeah, I definitely have been exposed to mold, there was water damage in my house, or I lived in a moldy basement, I will definitely run a mycotoxin test. So that's a urine, looking at what mycotoxins are coming out in the urine. If someone's like, I don't know, I don't think so, I'll run blood markers. And the blood markers I look at are a CD57 panel, which that's a particular type of white blood cell that fights stealth pathogens, but in some cases, exposure to mold can lower that quite drastically. A lot of things can do that, but it's kind of one of the things I look at. I look at complement C3A and complement C4A. I look at MMP9. I look at melanocyte stimulating hormone and transfer factor beta 1. Sorry, that's kind of a mouthful. So those are kind of the market. And if several of those are out of whack, I'm going to be like, and they've got some Lyme markers or some weird symptoms, then I might run a mycotoxin test. And again, the reasoning for this is typically insurance is going to cover, if they have good insurance will cover the lab work that I order. And the mycotoxin test is, typically an out-of-pocket test. So if we're 100% sure they've been exposed to mold, I'm going to go right for the mycotoxin test. And this is just kind of how I practice. I know there's other practitioners who are like, nope, we'll run all the things, but that's kind of how I work. So both of those, the mycotoxin test is very useful to see kind of if there are mycotoxins present in the system. And as you mentioned, like exposure to mold will weaken the immune system quite drastically, which can make you more susceptible to Lyme or Epstein-Barr or any of the co-infections or other viral infections, and adrenal fatigue. Oh, the thing I was going to circle back and say is another reason why testing for these stealth infections can be really helpful can be for assessing thyroid stuff. Because, a lot of thyroid patients, they have autoimmune thyroid, whether it's Graves or Hashimoto's. Hashimoto's tends to be more common, but Epstein-Barr, for example, it loves to live in the thyroid. So if it's hanging out in the thyroid in a reactivated state, the immune system is going to go a little nuts. It's going to try to kill the virus. It might end up making antibodies to the thyroid. So I find a lot of my patients with Hashimoto's, when we kind of clear out some of these stealth pathogens, we'll see an reduction in their thyroid antibodies and thus an improvement in their thyroid symptoms. The other thing that these infections can do is they will affect the conversion factor from T4 to T3. So if someone has a normal TSH, a normal T4, but their T3 is in the tank and they're having all the hypothyroid symptoms, that sometimes to me is a sign to look for infections, because Lyme in particular will kind of wreak havoc on that conversion pathway that happens in the peripheral tissues.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing that. And you covered so much, Dr. Kinney, but is there anything else I should have asked you that I didn't ask you? Anything else that you'd like to discuss?
Let's see. We talked about diet. We talked about, I think if you're listening and you're like, oh, I definitely think my adrenals are struggling. I think, obviously the stress practices that I talked about, layering some of the relaxation things, but going back to the basics is always a good idea. So making sure you have a good sleep hygiene practice. So going to bed at the same time, turning off screens, maybe some sort of calming routine in the evening. Getting morning sunlight is so beneficial for helping reset your circadian rhythm. So, and without sunglasses. So get outside in the morning, have your eyes exposed to sunlight. It's really great for helping to boost morning cortisol levels. The other thing I sometimes will have patients do is I'll have them, whether they have trouble sleeping or not, I'll have them take a little bit of melatonin before bed. And that will, again, help kind of reset the circadian rhythm, because when melatonin is high, it tells the body to have cortisol be low. And when melatonin is low, the cortisol naturally is high. So if you're not producing enough melatonin, particularly in the evening, the body may think, oh, I should be making cortisol. So a little bit of melatonin, initially when I'm treating someone, will kind of help us reset that circadian rhythm. I
When you
think
say a
that's
little,
probably
like a what do you say, like a
one to
milligram? Or,
3 milligrams. Yeah, usually 1 to 3. If they're having trouble sleeping, I might have them take closer to 3. And again, it's usually not for the helping of the sleep. It's for, some people are like, why am I taking this? I sleep fine. I'm like, no, it's really just to help, reset the circadian rhythm.
all right. Well, if you could let everyone know where they can find you, let them know about your podcast, let them know about your
Sure.
website, any other areas you want to direct them to.
Sure. So I hang out on Instagram a lot. If you want to follow me, I'm at Dr. Kinney, videos, stories, we try to put out content there. And my website is drerinkinney.com. I'm actually just in the process of rebranding myself. So eventually it will be the kinneyclinic.com, but probably right now, just go to my website. And my show is called The Dr. Kinney Show, which you can find on all the major podcast platforms. And Dr. Ozansky will be a guest in a few episodes, so you can check that out. And I bring on, we have a lot of topics that we cover, a lot of thyroid stuff, a lot of adrenal stuff, a lot of just different types of healing modalities. And yeah, that's probably, those are all the things.
All right. Well, of course, we'll make sure to put those links in the show notes. And yeah, definitely look forward to being on your podcast as well. That's how I found you. Just was a list. Was searching whenever I interview someone, I do research, and I happened to found that, I forgot who it was now, but I found that person on your
Oh,
podcast, and I was
great.
like,
Yeah.
oh, cool. And then I listened to some other episodes, and yeah, definitely recommend to check it out. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Kinney.
You're welcome.
I'm sure, yeah, sure listeners learn a lot about adrenals, and I learned some things as well. So again, thanks. I
That's
appreciate
why
it.
the podcast thing is great. I feel like I learn something every episode I interview someone. I'm like, oh, that's cool. I'm going to take that back to my practice. So it's a win-win for everyone. Win-win-win. It's a win for both people on the show, win for the listeners. It's a great medium. I love it.
Yeah, I definitely agree.